Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Callis. Speaking of sports, I'm here with Anthony Sorbellini of WestchesterCountyPost.com, and we're here to talk about the new rules that are coming for the 2020 Major League Baseball season, assuming there is one. And those three rules, which we'll talk about in this order, and I'm going to turn it over to Anthony on the first rule in a minute, but those three rules are the rule that says if the game goes extra innings, starting with the top of the 10th inning, there will be a runner on second base. No batters, just we're going to put a guy on second base. I thought that was beer league softball, but I'm going to give it to Anthony for a minute, and you obviously already know how I feel. The second rule we're going to talk about is that three batter minimum when a guy comes into the game, a relief pitcher. This is maybe to get rid of the lefty who comes in and pitches to one batter and then gets taken out. And there are some different things on that rule as well, but it's essentially the three batter per pitcher rule. And the third thing is going to be the universal DH. Finally, after World Series for decades where you had the DH in 4 games and the no DH in 3 or vice versa, that always struck me as weird in the World Series. They're at least for this season going to change that. So I'll throw it over to Anthony Sorbellini first to talk about the man on second to start the top of the 10th and every inning thereafter or half inning thereafter until somebody wins the game. I can see by your eyes you're not happy, Anthony. What do you think?
No, I hate it. It's not baseball. It's kind of a cop-out, shorter games and all that stuff, but, they call it free baseball for a reason in extra innings. I mean, I just constantly think, you're going to throw a guy on second, then you're going to have your leadoff guy just bunt them over to third, and then you're going to have a sac fly. Big deal. That's not going to exactly. That's not going to bring in any, hopefully, new fans. It's probably going to start alienating older fans more and more than what, baseball has already alienated enough. I think, the game has been like this for so long. Yes, I agree there needs to be some ways to update it and get it a little bit moving forward, but by doing that, it's essentially, kind of taking away the thrill of baseball.
Wow. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think it is such a bastardization of the game of baseball that, like you said, it's simply not baseball. My view of that, when I was a kid, and my father would play in softball leagues, it was like the Sunday afternoon beer league, and they only had 2 hours to play the game, or they had to get home for dinner before, they got hit with a spoon by their wives or something, and they just, to start the game, to start the extra innings in softball, they just throw somebody out on second because they did just want the game to be over. Now, I did hear John Smoltz, who I like as an announcer. John Smoltz actually said, I think this is a great idea. I think they should make it permanent because baseball is not a sport to be made for 17 or 18 inning games. And I'm like, well, baseball is a sport to be played to have a winner. And I don't know how many 17 or 18 inning games there are anyway. There's not that many. But again, the notion to me that you'd open it strikes me. Now, in the defense of this rule, which I am not really here to defend, they do it in women's softball in the NCAA. They do it in women's professional softball. They instituted it 2 years ago in the minor leagues. And Manfred at the time was quoted as saying, oh, I don't think this will ever be in the major leagues. Now, people who are for it will say, well, this is a different deal. It's 60 games. But I'm thinking, well, I don't know. What's the different deal? They're playing 60 games in 66 days. And that strikes me as a normal baseball schedule. So I agree with you. I think it's ridiculous. I'm trying to look at it from the other side. But if you just want to get out of a baseball game quickly to get out of a baseball game quickly, I think that's absurd. And to show you how absurd it is, I'll give them one alternative. Why not have 3 guys come out, take 5 swings, make it home run derby? Whoever hits the most home runs in 15 swings wins the game. That might even be faster because it would be over quickly. So I'm analogizing to the hockey shootout a little bit, which I'm also against. But what's interesting to me, including in the hockey shootout, as you know, they don't do that in the playoffs. So too here, we've just killed this rule. But at least they realize and are not going to do it in the playoffs. So I'll have to call up John Smoltz, don't have his number, and say, John, What about those 17, 18 inning games in the playoffs? They're all-time classics. So I think it's a big mistake. I'm really disappointed. And I'm afraid, frankly, Anthony, tell me what you think. I'm afraid if this goes well, whatever that means, that next year, and hopefully there's a regular 162 game season, next year they might say, oh, this worked out really well, so let's put it in permanently. What do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, it was already implemented in the minors. I know, like around a year and a half, 2 years ago, when the commissioner's office and Rob Manfred were discussing, pace of play. That was one of the proposed stipulations that they're going to try and experiment with in the minor leagues. I remember talking with my buddies and stuff like that, and I never thought it would happen, but now seeing that it will, I hate it. I'm
Here
just
we
thinking,
are.
yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of just a couple of just classic games, 15 inning games. I'm like, well, what's the magic of like you start in the bottom or the top of the 10th with a runner on second, and then
Oh, boy.
there's a single. It's like, okay, yeah, I mean, it's still a walk-off in the sense, but it's not the same. It's kind of a gimme. And then and then especially because baseball is such a stat-oriented sport that you're going to have people say, well, does this RBI count? Does that run count? He was put there. Does this count towards your on-base percentage? What does this count towards?
Yeah, the only thing I've heard about that is I know that if whenever a run scores like that, the run will be an unearned run. That's all I know. But you raise a good question. I guess if you hit a single up the middle and the guy scores, I guess that's an RBI because you drove in a run. But okay, let's leave that one for now. We're both on the same side of that one. The next rule I wanted to talk about is now the rule that has been talked about for years and is going to be implemented. I almost call it the Tony Larussa rule because Tony Larussa is the guy who originally would bring in 6, 7, 8 relievers. He totally changed the game whether we like it or not. But the rule is if you bring a reliever in, he has to face 3 batters. Now, I think there's been a little twist to that rule now because for this season anyway, again, and I'm worried it might go on beyond this year as well, but if you come in and there's 2 outs and you get the guy at the plate out, you don't have to face 3 guys. I think there was a pushback on the notion that your relievers who never really come out for the second inning, maybe your closer once in a blue moon in a gigantic game, maybe a middle reliever, but generally speaking, they're not going to make you, if you come in and get the guy for the 3rd out on your first batter, you are not then going to go to the dugout for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes and come back out. That's not going to happen. But obviously, if that guy gets on, you got to keep waiting and waiting. Obviously, if you bring a guy in with 1 out, he's going to have to face guys, et cetera, et cetera. So what are your thoughts on the pitcher has to face 3 batters rule again for this season?
I like it. One thing I've always had that I never, I guess, fully understood. I mean, I do to a degree, but it just drove me nuts. Was baseball is one of the rare sports where you get to see an entire inning without commercials. But then there's a pitching change and then the commercials come. So I'm looking at it from a pure viewer perspective. I hate breaks in between the innings. So somebody comes out, bring out your lefty specialist just to get one guy out, and then he could throw a pitch, ground ball to shortstop or whatever. It could be one pitch, and then we're going back to commercials because we're going to bring in another guy. So I'm looking at it purely from that. I like it. Yes, it's gonna, you're taking away jobs from these specialists. So, but then at the same time, it's 2020. It's you're professional athletes. You should be able to do more than pitch one guy. I mean, you're getting paid all this money, so you should be able to do more than one thing. So that's where I stand on it, purely from a consumer's perspective.
Well, I think that's a good point from a consumer's perspective. To me, again, it kind of changes the game of baseball a bit. And yeah, I'm old and I'm an old timer and I'm a purist. Again, I never understood the DH, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for this role, I think it's the same kind of thing. What's Oliver Perez going to do? He was going to pitch till he was 50, but now maybe he won't be able to do that. And there are a lot of other lefties. I'm just picking one that I know off the top of my head. But I'd prefer that it just be the game be the way it is, because now you're changing how a manager would manage a game. He should have the right, as stupid as I may think it is, and how time consuming, and you're correct, how time consuming it is, cue the commercials. I just think once you play with the actual timing of the game as opposed to the playing of the game, I think that's a problem again for me. And I'll say this, and I've said this for many years. You want to shorten the game of baseball for sure, absolutely, positively. Just remove 1 minute of commercials between every half inning, and the game will be shortened 18 minutes automatically. And I'd much prefer that. Of course, we know these guys aren't going to give up a nickel. And especially now with this year where everybody's going to be, the owners are going to lose billions and billions. Not that I care about that, but it's even going to be worse this year where they would never cut commercial time anyway. You know, I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid, there were doubleheaders every Sunday. My father and I went to Yankee Stadium. Every Sunday there was a doubleheader. Why? Because you were getting 2 games for the price of 1. The notion today that you would have owners schedule a doubleheader, sometimes they play them, but that owners would schedule a doubleheader. The owners are like, man, I got 81 dates. I'm not going to cut myself to 79. And I got to tell you, I'm going to go way back, and I'm going to guess they played, I'm going to say 15 doubleheaders a year on Sundays alone. And I always thought that was great. Now, again, I've said also recently, most people, including me, I don't think we'd stay for a doubleheader now because that's probably 8 hours with a half an hour between games. In the old days, you had games. You can look at some of these World Series games in the 60s into the 70s. They're 2 hours and 10 minutes. You go way, way back, they have extra inning games that took 1 hour and 58 minutes, and you want to go what happened. And they've tried to put in the clock. That's been a joke. I don't know if anybody gets penalized ever for not throwing it in 30 seconds or whatever the rule is.
And that's saving literally like a minute a game. That clock isn't doing anything.
So I'll say it again and you'll laugh at me, but if you took off 1 minute of commercial time between every half inning, and keep in mind, as you know, when it's a national game or heaven forbid a playoff game, the time between innings is even extended another 30 seconds, maybe a minute, I'm not sure. Why? So they can just sell more commercials. So I'm kind of against it. I understand your point, and it's a good one because that's how they get more and more commercials. I would analogize that a little bit to the last 2 minutes of an NBA game. I've said for years they should only allow each team 1 timeout in the final 2 minutes. And what would happen? Instead of playing 15 minutes for the final 2 minutes, because the team that's down 5 or 3 or 6 is fouling, it would be much quicker because you can only call timeout once. That, of course, will never happen. Why? Because if it's a close game, everybody's watching, so you want to have more commercials. And it's the old follow the money. It's been like that forever. It's not going to change in basketball. And if this works, I think that might be forever as well. I don't know. I know the first rule we talked about is just for 2020, but I'm just afraid once it seems to move the game along or make it faster or blah, 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 that we'll just try and keep them permanently. The final rule we're going to talk about is not, at least in my mind, as controversial as the first two, but the final rule is going to be the implementation of the universal DH. As everybody knows, in the NL, they never had a DH. In the AL, they've always had one since 1973. And it always struck me as just bizarre in the World Series that you'd play, depending on what park you're in, you would play a game with a DH or you would play a game without a DH. That, to me, was always another bastardization of baseball. But here we are now, a universal DH. I have a feeling that maybe it's going to be another thing after this year. They might want to try and put it in forever. Again, it's never made any sense to me that it wasn't one way or the other. But give me your thoughts on the universal DH for 2020 and maybe for the future.
Finally, I've been the biggest advocate for universal DH for years. I stand in the notion, these starting pitchers, relief pitchers, closers, etc., all these pitchers, they get paid to pitch. I don't care to watch them bunt a guy over or swing for the fences in the anomaly that, we'll have another Bartolo Colon hitting a home run with his helmet flying off again. That's when pitchers batting peaked, and it's never been the same since. So pitchers have had their moment of, Bartolo Colon doing all that and hitting and everything. I want to see these big-name guys get the outs, get the pitches, and I'm looking at it, too, from Better in the Game. where you have the interleague matchups to where the biggest thing is Chien-Ming Wang. When the Astros were in the National League, he was rounding third, messed up his foot, and his pitching was never the same, and his career was effectively ended.
You're right.
All because he was an American League pitcher and he had a hit and he had to run the bases. So pitchers are paid these hundreds of millions of dollars to pitch. They're not paid that to go bunt. They're not paid to go hit. They're paid to pitch.
Well, I'll say this, and I agree with you, but I'm a Koufax guy. I've read a lot about Koufax. I don't know if I can show you his picture on my wall up here, but Koufax was a lefty pitcher, as you know, in my view, the greatest pitcher ever, even though he only did it at that level for 5 years. But when he was on, he was the most dominant pitcher ever, in my opinion. But Koufax threw left, but he batted right. So I read stuff where the Dodgers hated for him to bat at all because, of course, his left arm was exposed to the pitcher. Having said that, I agree with everything you say. There was that occasional, and it was viewed, and I'm going back to the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was viewed to be kind of part of your game, which we all agree now is no longer part of your game. Are you a good hitting pitcher? I know when I did the top 10 baseball players of all time with my son, he had Walter Johnson in there, as did I. In fact, I think I had Walter Johnson and Koufax in the top 10 players of all time. He had Walter Johnson, Koufax, and Pedro Martinez in the top 10, which you can make a case for Pedro. But in any event, apparently there was one year that Walter Johnson hit 433, and he had like 97 at-bats or something. It wasn't like 20. It was just incredible. And it wasn't like he hit 320 in all the other years. He just had like a freak year. But I agree with you, the Bartolo Colon, which will be replayed for Met fans for the next 50 years, was an incredible moment, but I agree, kind of a stupid thing to have in 2020. The other fear I had when I really got into baseball and, knew that it started in 73, I thought it might have been the beginning of having 8 defensive players and the pitcher on the field, and then 9 offensive players. It would be like football to some degree, where you could play both positions, but maybe you'd have an all-offense team and an all-defense team, which actually is somewhat interesting. I'm obviously glad they didn't do that, but I thought maybe the DH was the beginning of that. Of course, that has not happened. So I'm with you on this one. I think there should be a universal DH. I know the players have always wanted that because that would be an extra job, essentially, in the National League. And the other thing I'll say, so now that's been in effect for 47 years. So how do you compare? And the guys with the algorithms, the analytics guys, they can compare. But how do you compare an American League pitcher nowadays with a National League pitcher? And the rule of thumb is, from an ERA perspective, is you add a half a run to the National League's the guy's ERA to compare him with the American League guy's ERA, because it's just unfair to the American League pitchers correctly that they have to face a killer lineup, whereas in the National League, the 8th hitter is usually your weakest hitter, and then you have the pitcher. So you could come out and maybe have an easy 8-9-1 inning or 7-8-9 inning. That's just not true with the DH. And normally your DH kind of bats in the meat of the order. So when you're getting to the bottom of the order, maybe your number 9 guy is weak, but we've seen some lineups in the major leagues in the last few years that 1 through 9, you're like, oh my goodness, this guy's batting 8th and 9th? They could bat 1st and 2nd for a bunch of major league teams. And so it's now become in the American League where you can really load up your lineup. But again, I think it'll be interesting because now the National League might have to change their rosters. They might be able to get that aging guy who could, get up out of bed and hit a line drive, who can't run on the field anymore. I think that's what's obviously going to happen in the National League. And I understand, again, this is all for a 60-game season. But in my opinion, it should be no different. It should be like a 162-game season, but with only 60 games. So I think we're in agreement, obviously, the universal DH. I hope they do keep that one forever after this year. We'll have to see what happens. So give me your final thoughts. And maybe you can tell me, do you think there'll actually be a baseball season? And then if you have any final thoughts on these 3 rules.
Final thoughts on these 3 rules. You know what? Whatever ones pass, whatever ones don't pass, I'm just happy to hopefully be watching baseball this season. And then, I think of all the four major sports, I think baseball has the best shot to continue to play or to play, just because, it's the social distancing aspect of it. So, fingers crossed. I'm literally, I'm tired of just sitting, not watching sports. So, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Yeah, it's really going to be a bombardment, though, because if all of these things come to fruition, and I'm not sure they will, I'll talk about baseball in a minute, but you're literally going to have NBA playoffs, NHL playoffs, a sprint, not a marathon baseball season, right? Everybody always says, oh, it's a marathon, not a sprint. This year it's a sprint. I think you saw the stat, the Nationals after 60 games were like 12 or 13 games under 500, and they came back to win the World Series. You can't say, oh, we got another 140 games left. It's just not going to be like that. So I don't like the first two rules. I know you like I know you don't like the man on second rule, but you do like the three batter pitcher rule. We're in agreement on universal DH. I think the problem for baseball, I think you're right. On the field, it's got a better chance than the other three sports. But I think the problem for baseball that will not be in the NBA because they're in a bubble, will not be in the NHL because each conference is going to be in one city. I think the problem for baseball is going to be you have to travel. Now, I understand you know what the schedule is, so I'll just use the East because that's what we know and where we live. The AL East, they're going to play 40 games. They're going to play each team in their division 10 times. And then they're going to play the opposite, the NL East. They're going to play them 20 times. The problem is I'm pretty sure the Marlins are in the NL East, and they're in Florida. So it's not just Yankees, Mets, Red Sox, or Yankees, Mets, Phillies, or they announced the Yankees are going to open in Washington. That's kind of that Northeast corridor where we all kind of live. That's not terrible. It'll be interesting whether they take trains or fly. That'll be interesting. I guess if you have your own plane, which most of these teams do, you'll probably fly. But it strikes me that there's going to be some issues that basketball will not have, but it's not on the field issues. You're right. Physically distancing other than home plate pitcher-catcher, home plate catcher-batter. I did see a photograph from the 1918 flu epidemic where they had a picture of a baseball game where the batter, the catcher, and the umpire all had masks on in addition to the catcher's mask and the umpire mask. I just saw one picture like that. And I even looked, the 1918 season was cut short by a month, but that seems to be more about World War I than it was about the flu epidemic. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think baseball's problem is in the travel because you're going to be in all these different cities. Yes, it'll be closer, but Arizona to California, they're terrible now. Texas is terrible now. Florida, 9,000 cases or whatever they had. I mean, now this might all change in a month. I mean, look at New York. New York seems like the New York teams, as you know, are leaving Florida to come back and have spring training in New York.
Yeah.
So things really have turned around. But I think you're right. I think baseball on the field has the best chance. We haven't talked about the NFL. Maybe we'll do that another time because they're going to have their own problems, I think, because you've seen what's happened to the colleges. They came in for practice in football. There's 37 Clemson players and 23 LSU players, and they haven't even started full-blown workouts yet. So we'll have to wait and see. But I agree. I think baseball's only problem is in the travel, not in the actual playing of the game. So I'm with you. I can't wait, but it's going to be interesting to have essentially four sports going at once. That's never happened. And I hate to say it because we're both baseball guys, but I think that's going to be bad for baseball because the NHL and NBA will be in the playoffs, and the NFL, whatever you think of it, I think it's great. I like baseball more, but it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So baseball, I was hoping they'd come back early because they'd have a monopoly if they've been playing. I'm not saying they could play now because of what's going on in our country, but had they, and there was a spitting contest over money, of course, because it's always all about the money. I thought it might be about the pandemic protocols with a positive, but I was wrong. It's still all about the money, even with that. So I thought they could have a monopoly for a month. I thought they'd get started by now, and that's not going to happen. So I hope baseball makes it through. I hope they play. I still think it's an open issue, Anthony, for all of these. That Women's Pro Soccer League opened up, and they lost a full team before they opened up. Mm-hmm. And the two biggest stars, the Megan Rapinoe and Carly Lloyd, They're not playing. They just said we're not going to play. So I don't think any basketball stars have announced. I don't think any baseball stars have announced. I haven't heard anything about hockey yet, but we'll just have to see. But you're right. Baseball has the best chance. And boy, I'd love to see it. And think how important these games are going to be now with 60 games instead of 162. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Just piggybacking off of your last thought, how important every game is, it's going to be like this whole season is just the month of September. September baseball. It's going to be awesome.
That's 100% correct. I can't wait. Keeping my fingers crossed that it'll start. So this is Steve Callis along with Anthony Sorbellini. Speaking of sports, we'll see you the next time.